the USS Monitor, right here in these waters. Hampton Roads, March 9th, 1862. Why, we had no idea that ship was even being built, much less that it would appear here in these waters and fight to a standstill. The great CSS Virginia, which some Northerners are fond of calling the Merrimack. The Virginia had shown what a lethal craft it was the previous day when it sank or ran aground the USS Congress, USS Cumberland, and the USS Minnesota. We had every hope that ironclads like the Virginia and similar craft would be able to lift the blockade, this pernicious blockade that is being imposed on the Southern people. Unfortunately, the Monitors put an end to that hope.
Mr. Lincoln, what single event or incident has surprised you most in the last 4 years?
If you had to boil down one single event, it would be the firing on Fort Sumter. We did nothing that would have caused that, but that behind us, I think if I may be philosophical, it's the sheer evil that comes out of a war, on both sides in some cases. The sheer evil of what man can do to man. And in the case of a civil war, and it is a civil war, what brother can do to brother, that we have experienced, that we have seen, that we have tried to find ways to live with, that we will be paying for generations to come. Don't tell me 50 years from now that some disease can't be cured. We may have killed that man that could have cured it. The sheer brutality of this war has shocked me. You look at our boys coming home when released from their prison camps, mere skeletons. How in God's name can they treat people that way? How in God's name?
Who do you regard, Mr. Lincoln, as your most trusted and invaluable advisor through these dark times?
I, as you know, upon being elected, sought to bring in the best people I could. I did not want to bring in necessarily friends, as is often the case. The situation we were in was far too serious for that. You may recall that in forming my cabinet, I brought in 3 of my rivals for the presidential nomination of the Republican Party. That meant that we had a lot of getting used to doing. They certainly were not used to me. They were men of considerable more formal education, and it took them a while to know that a man that occasionally puts his feet on a desk still has something to say. Mr. Seward, our Secretary of State, a man that thought he was going to have that nomination, took him a little while to realize that I did not need a prime minister. And once he learned that, he became my most trusted advisor. Then after we saw Mr. Cameron go on to better things in the diplomatic corps, we brought in Mr. Stanton to run our Department of War. My last personal contact with Mr. Stanton was as a lawyer in Cincinnati, going there believing I would be a participant, and then behind my back being called a guerrilla. We put that beside us. By the way, in that regard, I have been called a guerrilla several times. Good General Grant has been called a drunkard. You may recall that when I heard him call that, I asked what he was drinking so I could send it to my other generals. And General Sherman, who has had some rough spots, mostly, with the media, has been called a crazy man. So it would seem a guerrilla, a drunk, and a crazy man are winning this war, sir. Just to finish up my my young secretaries, Nicolay and Hay, and Mr. Stoddard, provide me with that youthful vigor that we need at times like this. Although, to be honest, I sometimes have more vigor than they do. But they represent that generation we are slowly wiping out, and their input is quite valuable to me. And many times they have served as my eyes and ears at various places in the field.
They refer to you as the tycoon, I understand.
Well, they can call me anything they want.
As long as they help you win.
They're doing that, sir.
Mr. Davis, who do you regard as your most trusted and invaluable advisor?
Without question, the Secretary of State, Mr. Judah P. Benjamin. You may know that Mr. Benjamin was a United States Senator from 1853 to 1861. He's a great orator and a magnificent spokesman for the Southern cause. Before he became our Secretary of State, he was the Attorney General and the Secretary of War. In both offices, as in the present office, he has excelled. He is eloquent. He has a fine legal mind. He is systematic in his habits, and he has an enormous capacity for work.
He's a gentleman of the Hebraic persuasion, isn't he?
He is indeed. That caused a little problem with us at one time. He's my loyal and trusted friend. He's my comrade, my counselor, confidant. He challenged me to a duel in 1853 on this very issue. But fortunately, it did not materialize, because when I realized the error of my ways, I apologized to him, and he was gracious enough to accept the apology. His smile is said to infuriate some of the members of my government, but I assure you, sir, it gives me nothing but comfort.
I wonder, given some of the tension that I've heard here and some of the tempers flaring, if perhaps you gentlemen, if you'll pardon me, I wonder if you've not allowed personal pride to stand in the way of resolving the issues between the two sections of the country. What would you say to that, Mr. Davis?
Not at all. Personal pride has absolutely nothing to do with this conflict. Not as far as I'm concerned, anyway. I did not ask to be elected President of the Confederacy. And when this war is successfully concluded, I will resign that position in favor of a more competent executive. The issues between the sections of what was previously the United States centered on a loss of equilibrium that the framers had built into the Constitution, and the loss of which was hurtling us toward what your Secretary of State, Mr. Seward, referred to as an irrepressible conflict. As I said earlier, the fugitive slave law should have been enforced. The territories acquired from Mexico should have been developed in a way that was in everyone's interest, not just in the interest of northern manufacturers, thereby neutralizing the pernicious effects of many developments of the 50s, which were hurtful to the South, such as the Compromise of 1850, the repeal of the pro-slavery Ostend Manifesto, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the adoption of the anti-slavery Topeka Constitution, and the repeal of the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. The 160-acre concept, I've already said, was very hurtful to us.
You need not
the
repeat
Northern
yourself,
Pacific.
Mr. Davis.
I'm not going to repeat the tariff. If these things
Too late.
had not been done, and that ceaseless agitation on the issue of slavery. Why, we rescued the Negro from a condition of base savagery in Africa, and we brought him here to these shores. And we introduced him to the blessings of civilization and of Christianity. And instead of being respected for this, we are subjected to the vilest ignominy and made to feel like pariahs and sinners and demons.
Where is whipping and branding and breaking up families?
Those
in
are
the blessings of
highly
civilization?
exceptional. The vast, overwhelming majority of slaves are treated as you would treat your property, with respect and kindness to preserve it. We want to preserve our property. We don't want to damage it, and we certainly don't want to destroy it. It's just common sense, Mr. Boyd.
Mr. Lincoln, I wonder, have you perhaps allowed personal pride to stand in the way of resolving the issues between North and South?
Mr. Davis makes slavery sound so wonderful, it makes me wonder why more white people in the South haven't tried it.
Or had it tried on themselves?
Or have it tried on themselves. Personal pride. Some people say all you have to do is look at me to know I don't have much of that. I think Mrs. Lincoln would tell you that. I know you ask a serious question. It's one that I've asked myself more than once. Reminds me of a story.
Many things do.
Yes. I recall a fanciful tale where one man came up to me one time and he pointed a gun at me and he said, "I swore if I ever saw anyone uglier than me, I would shoot him." And I said, "Sir, if I'm uglier than you, I deserve to be shot." If I am more stubborn than Mr. Davis, I too deserve to be shot. We today have that great Robert E. Lee encased in the arms of the General Grant and his forces. He has two other armies roaming around. We have nothing to do. Their desertion rate will see them in. We control over 90% of his territory, and he sits here thinking he has some more to gain by sacrificing his young men and our young men. If that isn't stubbornness, I, sir, don't know what it is. Give up. Give up. It's not your life that's being lost. It's their lives.
If you are successful, Mr. Davis, miraculously enough, in winning independence for your country, for how long do you think your country will maintain the institution of slavery?
I have no idea
Speculate.
how long the institution of slavery will last. It will last for as long as it is deemed to benefit both races, and neither I nor anyone else can know how long that will be. I will say this, however, Mr. Boyd and Mr. Lincoln, that it will be for us, the Confederate States of America and the 11 sovereign states that comprise the Confederate States of America, to make that decision. It will not be for the United States or any state that comprises the United States or any agency or officer of the United States to make that decision. We will make the decision as to when slavery will end, if it ever ends.
Mr. Lincoln, assuming the Confederacy were to win its independence, what would the next 5 to 10 years hold for the United States?
That, sir, is like asking me to assume I can fly across this room. Both are impossible. We have not invested the lives of so many of our young men, the great expense, the destruction, both North and South, in culture, buildings, so forth, to ever consider such a thing. There is no Confederacy. He pretends to be president of what is a rebellious force. That's all it is. That's all it ever was. And that's how history will remember it. No. He will not make a decision on slavery. Sir, that decision was made 2 years ago. Perhaps the news doesn't get to Richmond as fast as it did.
Why are you so focused on slavery, Mr. Davis, when it appears you could end the war by accepting its abolition?
Mr. Boyd, we are not so focused on slavery as you imagine. To begin with, the southern states initially had no interest whatsoever in slavery when they were settled in the 17th and 18th centuries by Mr. James Oglethorpe and other Englishmen. They were encouraged to adopt the institution by New England slave traders from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. Mr. Lincoln surely knows this. They made huge profits by going to Africa, buying slaves in Africa, transporting them here, and then selling them to Southern farmers. In the Constitutional Convention in 1787, it was the southern states that demanded a cessation of the slave trade, and it was the New England slave traders who insisted on extending it, which is why they compromised on the year 1800. And then it was extended to 1808 at the insistence of the New England slave traders. Further, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, out of which 5 states in the North were carved, and the document of which prohibited slavery, was a gift to the North from the state of Virginia, crafted by 2 of her sons, Mr. Edward Carrington and Mr. Richard Henry, assisted by Mr. Nathan Dane of Massachusetts. Yes, we believe that the institution of slavery is well suited for a primarily agricultural society. Yes, we feel it was ordained by the Almighty because it benefits both races. And yes, we feel it is vastly superior to the system of labor that obtains in the North, the so-called free labor, which isn't very free. Nevertheless, our first objective, and you need to know this, Mr. Boyd, if you don't already, our first objective is to validate the right of secession and independence, to create a politically independent entity. It is not the maintenance of slavery. Let me say again so there'll be no mistake about it. We want to validate our right to secede from the federal union, and we're willing to sacrifice the institution of slavery to obtain it.
I wonder, Mr. Lincoln, why you are so focused on slavery when it appears you could now reunite the country by accepting where it existed at the time of your election.
Mr. Davis's recitation of all those facts reminds me of a story. It seems that this farmer was sitting in his house one day, and his son ran in and he said, Pa,